Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock. Now, today we are talking about the process of finding the perfect investment property that suits all of your wants, desires, and criteria. Now, the easiest way to do that is you start with a map of Australia and you use one of the real estate portals and you add in your filters. You add things like it has to be below X median price, you want a particular yield, you might want a certain days on market, might have an idea on vendor discounting, or all sorts of different ways that we can slice and dice and cut the data to narrow down your search to find the perfect property. But my guest today, who's been on the show a number of times, is data scientist extraordinaire Kent Lardner, and he shares a cautionary tale on how that can actually go wrong and gives us rather than a thought experiment, a data experiment to show that use of these filters can cut out properties that are A-grade investment potential properties. So we unpack the data, the metrics, and the dangers of using these filters and how it can actually be a market driving phenomenon as investors use these filters and these new software platforms to chase the best prospects around the country. It's a really interesting, different way of thinking about your property investment search, but I think really important for us all to understand and make sure that we're not narrowing things down too far and missing out on opportunities. Anyway, to unpack all of that, here's Kent. Kent Lardner, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Hello, good to be back. It's been about 8 years.
It has been about 8 years, which is amazing because I think the show's only been going for 7, but there you go. I mean, you're the data scientist, not me. And the reason why we've got a data scientist in the house again is a bit of a cautionary tale, because what's amazing about the property market and the data that we have available today is that you can get all sorts of data points. You can literally take a viewpoint of the entire map of Australia and go, I'm going to buy the best investment property for me with this data. And what an amazing opportunity that is. But with that comes some risks. And one of the ways that you sort of narrow it down from the big Aussie map is filters. And you want to talk to me about the danger of filters. What are we talking about?
Well, in statistical terms, say that 7 times fast. It's often referred to as overfitting when you're looking at a model. You're just trying to do too much. In the case of suburb analysis, it's overfiltering, and you're compressing down the selection of suburbs or properties down to so many filters that all it takes is one filter to reject, and you've ignored an entire suburb that would otherwise be a great suburb. And a really good case study that we'll cover today is an example where one of those filters that's taught in one of these training courses is you include a positive growth for medians over the last 3 months for the suburb. But the problem is the particular suburb we're looking at has a bit of an odd distribution and only has a handful of sales each month. So what can often happen is if an expensive property sells, the median can go up, and if a few cheaper properties sell in one particular period, then the median could go down. Is that necessarily a price increase or a price fall, or is it just the median shifting around based on the composition of what's been selling? So the point I wanted to raise is that a lot of these filters are becoming rather sophisticated. There's some beautiful looking software, very sophisticated looking software that are, I believe, knocking out a massive volume of houses and suburbs. And what they're doing is they're corralling or moving a number of people who are subscribing to those software platforms. They're pointing them all towards the same few suburbs. So it becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. So I'm calling BS on the fact that you're ignoring regions that are fundamentally very, very good, ignoring the properties in those regions because they're totally cut out, and they're directing everyone to far north Queensland or 2 or 3 regions and then the suburbs within those regions. And that's got a lot of risk attached to it. So I think it's sending people in the wrong direction.
Well, you're about to give us some insights into that. And for my part, I kind of think about it. Now, this is a bit of a weird tangent, but I mean, it's my bloody show.
Yeah.
You sometimes you see interviews with let's say a lovely lady, and she's looking for a man, and she'll sort of say, "Well, this is what I'm looking for." Starting with must be 6'1" or taller, and then I'm like, "Oh, hang on a minute." Well, Kent and I aren't 6'1",
No.
and we might be the actual perfect person for you. So just with your first little toggle of the filter, you're actually you're getting rid of, well, let's be honest, most of the male population in Australia, and to think that your soulmate could never be 5'11", it's such a bizarre way of looking at things, and it's not too dissimilar to the real estate filters, although like a weird analogy, I'll grant you.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. And I probably don't watch the same videos that you do, but
No.
nonetheless. But there's some rather simple points to raise. Is you put a median price filter on, so that's the given. That's the first one most people use, and it ignores the fact that that's just the middle value, and it's the middle value at a point in time. And it may even ignore the fact that there may be a bimodal, odd shaped distribution for that suburb. So that median means nothing. The other thing it ignores is half the properties are typically going to sell below that median price. So you've cut out half of the suburb because you've misused that filter. So I think that's one example.
And you've given us an example. So rather than a thought experiment, you've done a data experiment to show, yes, okay, well, I could find a property that fits within the filters, that has good prospects, but it's less about what it found, but what it can't find with these filters.
Well, yeah, look, so I've written a bit of a post on my LinkedIn newsletter, and I'll just quickly go through some of the example of filters being used. This is not complete. This is just a handful of them. So the proportion of renters. Okay, that's a given. The logic behind that is rental tenure from the ABS. Most people like to pick a range, not too small. You're looking for that just right measurement to say you don't want a market that's 55 or 60% renters, because when COVID hit, those areas that were in that 55, 60, 70% mark got hit really hard because the whole region, the whole suburb were renters. So you're looking for a sweet spot there. Okay, that one's pretty okay. The next one's vacancy rates. Now, I've got a real problem now with vacancy rates, because if you're measuring vacancy rates at a suburb level, a suburb with only a handful of properties managed by real estate agents, all you've got to do is add one or two vacancies. It could be just a little data blip. It could be just a whatever that happens in data space. And suddenly your vacancy rate's up to 3%, then it's down again. So if that jumps up to that 3% mark for that data, because of that data blip, you've now wiped out possibly the best investment suburb you've ever found, without understanding what's going on. I think the other call out with vacancy rates as well is, look at the count. Don't just look at the percentage. Look at the count, and then zoom out a bit, because renters are mobile. They'll move one suburb to the next to the next. So, I've got a bit of a problem with vacancy rates being used as a filter at a suburb level. I've got a few other problems. Auction clearance rates. Auctions are pretty common in the southern states, been rather common in Victoria for some time. But if you look at some regions like ours, or even suburbs through a region like Newcastle, auctions aren't the norm. They might be 50% of the property sold. So why would I rely entirely on vacancy rates and ignore the fact that half the other market is private treaty? So I've got a bit of an issue with vacancy rates, because they're not truly representative of the whole market, and they're a really small sample size. And they can jump
the media
around.
reports on them every week.
They love it. But they do that for a reason, because it gives them something to present on a Monday morning. The auction clearance rate, when we used to do the newsletter out on a Monday at the Real Estate View portal, vacancy rates were always a beauty. People loved it. So I understand why the media do it. That's different. But if you're a sophisticated investor or a buyer's agent, you know better. You should know better. The next one, days on market. I've got a bit of an issue there. It's for the same reason as medians. days on market can be a little bit volatile. You get a few expensive properties, can take a bit longer to sell. You might be up in the Coffs Harbour area where you've got a handful of properties that are really large lots on one side of the highway and smaller normal metro type properties on the other side. Depending on what's selling, that can vary. So, days on market, a lot of people like to put a filter on days on market, but I think that's pretty harsh. Vendor discounting's the next one on the list, really hard to measure. What are you measuring against? Measuring against the midpoint value that the agent put on the first listing, because usually, or what it's meant to be, is the cumulative days on market, which is what was it listed when I first saw it, and how long did it take to sell? And then you aggregate those at the suburb level and take the median. That's not a robust metric at all, because your starting point, what price do I start? Was the price right by the agent, et cetera, et cetera? So there's lots of limitations with vendor discounting. I've never liked it, and I still don't like it. Stock on market's the next one, which looks at how many properties are listed for sale as expressed as a percentage of the total stock of properties or houses. Another one is yield. Now, classic one about yield, and I'll finish off. I've got a couple more to go. So the next one is yield. The problem is with the yield is you're measuring the median house price and the median rental price, and there you've got your yield. But that really only makes sense if you're buying a property smack bang on the median price. What happens if you're buying below the median price? Yield's going to be a bit different. So I don't like using yield, especially at the suburb level. Median price growth, that's the case study we're going to talk about. We knocked out a suburb because it dropped by 1%. Yet it's a cracker of a suburb in the Newcastle SA3, right? So under 750K property, it's a beauty. Rental price growth as well. Here's another one. Rents have surged and gone crazy, but once they hit a certain point where people are spending 30 to 40% of their household income on rents, you're probably not going to get a lot more rental growth. So I don't know if I'd be relying too much on that. And then the last one was pipeline supply building approvals, which are totally abnormal right now, right? Off the charts, crazy. Demand's been high. So there come a couple of key things. So wrapping that up then and moving on to some case studies. What I did is I did a spreadsheet and I said, how many did we start with? And we started out with about 3,500 suburbs after applying a pretty simple filter. We just said, how many have at least 3 sales a month, so the numbers are a little bit more robust? That's the only thing I did to start with. So I said, okay, what did I end up with to begin with? And we ended up with, in total, about, let me just give you a quick count there. The total was, we started with 3,190 odd suburbs, and that gave me a total of listings to play with before we start doing any of these other filters, about 80,000 listings. Okay, just houses, and with that minimum volume of sales. And then we applied some filters.
Did you put a price on it as well?
No, I haven't put a price on this one yet. So now I've put the filters on. Okay, so what are the filters? What filters did you put on, Kent, is the question. So, okay, what I did is I started with stock on market. That was the first one. I didn't want anything more than 2.5% stock on market. The next one was days on market. Didn't want anything more than 40 days. So I'm going through what typically people would do in the software or spreadsheets, whatever. The next one was the 3-month price change. I wanted 1% growth in the last 3 months. Right. Okay, that's good. I put a price filter on it, $750,000 house price median or below. I then applied a yield, which a lot of people love to do, 4.5% yield. Okay, that's fine. And I did the rental tenure between 10% and 50%. Just that sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone there. Okay, what did that return? That got us down to a total number of suburbs of about 190 odd suburbs.
From 16,000 or thereabouts.
Oh, well, actually, the starting suburbs was, in this case, 3,190 odd. So, over 3,000.
Because they got to be big enough to have some transactions happening.
Yeah, so we just, just to play, just so we weren't jumping at shadows with crazy metrics. So, and then we plummeted down there, obviously. So, we lost. But what's really important there is that we knocked out entire regions that would be classified as really good regions to look at. So if you ignore If you ignore the forest and just go straight for that suburb tree type metric, suddenly you're knocking out an entire region that you could look for and find properties that would meet your criteria all day long. And that leads us to our little case study. So this case study sent us pretty much to North Queensland. That's kind of that final list gave us Perth and North Queensland, a little bit of Central Queensland, but all eyes then went up to Townsville, which is where all eyes are currently, right? So that's my first issue. This filtering effect not only ignores really good regions and lots of good options, it then narrows the focus of those 200 or 300 or 400 investors or buyers agents looking at that. It focuses them all on Townsville. So it becomes self-fulfilling.
And you can kind of, and you can kind of see that right now. I mean, Townsville is, the standing room only for buyers agents right now. And if everyone's on the same hymn sheet, then, I mean, in some respects, it's great to understand where people would go based on certain filters, because you can either decide, all right, well, I'm going to get in there early, or I'm going to not make the same mistake they did and expand it a little bit broader and find something that looks identical, except there's a data blip that would have caused them to not even look at it.
Exactly. And what that did is that culled it down, and we only end up with one suburb in New South Wales. One.
Wow. That
was it. And we'd know that one because it's near Rutherford. It's Tillara. So it's a local suburb that we both know. But, that's the first issue, right? So we're funneling everyone in one direction, and we're ignoring a lot of really good quality suburbs because of these crude filters that are, quite frankly, I think they're wrong. So they're overcooking it. So the case study then is I grouped together all of the suburbs by SA3. So an SA3 level search, every suburb in that statistical area 3. And the case study was, I just picked on some locations that we both know. Newcastle SA3, Lake Macquarie East and Lake Macquarie West. And they serve up plenty of suburbs, plenty of properties under 750K. But all but one of them, all but one suburb, all got knocked out. So
really?
Yeah. So now then I pulled up the search, and I did the search from low price to high, and it took me all of about 30 seconds to find a property selling for $595,000 in Woodbury.
Right.
Now the yield for that is in excess of 5%. The reason why it got knocked out of those filters is because that suburb median dropped by 1%. That was it. That was the only reason why it didn't make it. So I've ignored that property and ignored that suburb entirely because of that one little thing. And I just don't think it's the right approach. The software might look great. It might look clean. It's, beautiful looking, but it's delivering crap.
That suburb turned out to be 5'11", and that wasn't enough.
It's your dream. Yeah. It's your dreamboat husband. Or girlfriend, whatever,
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying.
Well, we've got a broad appeal. Yeah. So one thing that I didn't realize I want to unpack in all of those data points is vendor discounting. Now, I haven't looked, admittedly, at the metrics of how that data is compiled, but in my head, I kind of thought it's listing price versus sold price, and then it gives you a percentage. But you opened my eyes to the fact that, okay, well, sometimes a property will be listed for a price and it might drop and then it drops again. But when it drops a second time, it's less likely to stick on the market because there's a very good argument to say, well, it's closer to what the value is. But then the first drop, well, it's obviously too far. So if you aggregate them kind of both together, you're going to get a different result from, say, a property that drops in price once. So when you are running these filters, it probably does make sense to understand how that data is compiled, right? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If if you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well. Right?
Oh, yeah, you should if you're using them. And I'm arguing actually rethink. But
Don't use.
Yeah, forget about it. There's better options. But, if you look at days on market and you look at discounting, they're fairly volatile in their own right. So forget about how they're measured. Just look at what they are, and they are very volatile. So it depends on when you open your fancy suburb filters and what month you're in, whether it's going up or down. So that volatility doesn't really work for anybody. But if we look at discounting, it's like, well, okay, how do I measure this? It should be cumulative. It should be the first asking price. But do I take the upper? Do I take the lower? Do I take the mid? Do I take the price that they put in the back end that only REA see? So there's all sorts of constraints and limitations to that individual metric that may not really be necessary, because you've got some, I believe you've got better metrics anyway that can be a catch-all for market movement. I like inventory as an example. Very stock standard measure used in America. Great way to aggregate by region, great way to compare regions. It doesn't really matter if there's expensive and cheaper properties in there, etc. It's a good metric. And you don't need all of the abundance of these other metrics that have volatility and constraints. At least, I think people can understand what it means. It's supply and demand rolled together.
Yes.
How many properties for sale? How many are selling, expressed as a ratio count of months stock.
And you were the first person I ever heard in Australia talking about inventory, and now I think it's kind of part of the lexicon of property investment at large. I want to unpack one particular thing. Like, let's take one of those data points in isolation. You mentioned rental tenure before. I think there's enough evidence to say that too high a percentage of rental properties, let's say, as you say, more than 50%, is not good news for a market that wants to appreciate, say, because there's plenty of evidence to say, well, gentrification really comes from owner-occupiers, right? Landlords don't want to pretty up the place too much because they don't necessarily get the rental increase benefit. But people that live there, they do want to sort of chip away, and it's a way to manufacture equity is to do some renovations, and they get that obvious benefit. So you can definitely see why people would want to chuck that in, because the data supports that it does have an influence. And then you take things like that, and the bank will impose limits on you. They will literally say, you have pre-approval for 750K on the proviso that it's a property that yields at least 4%. So straight away, you've got a data point that has some proven value. You've got two constraints put in from the bank. It seems completely reasonable for the property investor to chuck those filters in. But you're saying even things like that, I mean, we unpacked the median, but that's the wrong way of looking at it. But what, like, how else do we find something without filtering it down to our requirements?
Yeah, so let's just pick on the first one. Rental tenure as a range is not going to knock out too many. If you put an upper limit on it of, say, 50 or 55%, you might knock out a few of those university suburbs. And that's about it. So that's not savage. That's not a bad guy. But rental yield, for example, you're better to measure that at the property level, because you're not buying the suburb, you're buying that property. So, and typically a lot of investors are looking for a property that's going to give you a better yield. So generally that's not going to be the stuff at the top end of the price range. It's often going to be something at the median or lower, mostly lower. So you're better off to do your rental cash flow estimate. And it's not, more often than not, it's not really yield the bank's looking for. They're more looking for cash flow. What's your income and what's the income from the rental of the property net, and how you're going to service your loan. So it really comes down to an individual rental price estimate, or AVM, for that individual property, more than some median based yield. So that answers the first bit. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, your second bit, well, what's the alternative? You zoom out.
Yeah.
Zoom out to the statistical area 3, in my view, where we're looking at those macro things. You've got some evergreen metrics in there that, is there a good hospital? Great. Okay. Are there GPs in the area? There was a great case study where a new hospital got built out at Mudgee, but then I found all this news of people saying, I moved to Mudgee, but I couldn't find a GP. I moved here because there was a hospital. I've got diabetes. I need access to a GP, and I just didn't distinguish the two. I thought that they went hand in hand. I thought if there's a new hospital, I don't have any issues with accessing GPs. Well, they did. So you want to look at those macro things, livability. You want to look at those economic factors such as job diversification. So, can I access a university? Are there good schools? Is it safe? What's the socioeconomics? Is it too far away from a city? Can I still travel within a few hours, especially if I've got hybrid work arrangements, which seems to be like 2 in 3 jobs now seems to be hybrid. So you weigh up all of those things, and a lot of those things don't really change month by month by month. So they're not going to be exposed to that silly monthly suburb level volatility filter, right? So you got those macro things, and then you can overlay a handful of property level metrics that make sense. Is inventory surging? Is pipeline supply okay? Is affordability okay? But you don't need to overcook it, because you're saying, are the fundamentals of this area good? Is the rental market solid? Can I rent this property out? Is the economy okay?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very easy to utilize these tools that are at our fingertips, and we assume that, they're valuable, because otherwise why would REA or why would Domain have them if they don't make sense? But it kind of relies, I mean, the onus is on you, the user, to understand the volatility of this data, and little things like price segmentation with medians can actually kind of have you destroying a huge pool of properties that actually meet your criteria. It's just that the data is skewed in a way that if you crunch it on that particular filter, you're gonna miss out.
You're going to miss out. And I love price segmentation, the distribution of prices at a suburb level, because I can see if I'm buying here, how many properties are above that price point. Am I buying in the upper 5% or the upper 10%? Am I setting a record for the suburb? So I think the suburb level metrics all relevant, but I think it's relevant after the event. After you find the property that you like, you shortlist 4 or 5 properties, then you do your due diligence, and looking at the suburb and comparing the price of your property versus the price distribution or the price segmentation of the suburb. That's just part of the DD, because it helps you then fine tune what 1 or 2 properties you're going to suggest or put forward for your client if you're a buyer's agent, or what property I like as an investor that meet my criteria. Because now I've found 8 or 10 times the volume of houses that the other lot have found, because they've all gone to Townsville, and they've left all the good properties to me down south.
It makes me think of a property that I used to own that anytime you ran it through an AVM, it would just really sing. It was 20% more than what its actual market would be. But whatever the algorithm was doing, or however the filters worked, it actually was over delivering on paper. And that was actually an opportunity, because if you're not too highly leveraged, the banks won't send a valuer. They'll actually just do an AVM, and you're off to the races. And I think there's actually I wonder if there's an opportunity to look for properties that kind of outperform, but the data is saying otherwise. So say, for example, if we look at an area that has a weird price segmentation, people will filter it out very, very quickly. And the property market investing landscape is different. It used to be sort of like, I'll buy around the corner from where I live. Whereas now we've got this real national focus, and a lot of people are in the same game. A lot of the people are filtering down. Do you think that there's actually enough competition in some of these places where a little bit of understanding about how this filter could give you the wrong result can actually almost be a strategy? Would you go so far as to say that?
Well, the banks and the fraud departments in the banks are quite aware of that, the gaming of AVMs for leverage. So that's where the loan to value ratio come into it. So they're pretty mature. They've been at this game for 15 plus years in the AVM space. The biggest risk that
Sorry, I want to retract now. That was actually a mate's house. That wasn't something I.
But look, it was one of those case studies that I covered with a couple of banks quite a few years ago. I'm back in the AVM space now,
Right.
working with PEXA and University of New South Wales. So that's my day job. And but the biggest risk is that fraudulent play where they know that they can overvalue a property, present everything, and then do a few of them in one fell swoop. Usually, that's the profile of a fraudulent case where there's multiple properties, multiple parties all involved, and they're all gaming it. One of probably the bigger risks is the incorrect description of a house. So if you're in an area where you know that a bathroom coefficient is going to change the price by 30 or 40%, which can happen in some AVM areas. So you misclassify a toilet as a bathroom, and suddenly now it's a 2-bathroom house. What usually happens is a two bathroom property can, depending on the model, can classify it with renovated properties. So you got older properties. Your property might be an older 3-bedroom, one bathroom, older style property, typical of say Newcastle. But then when people do a renovation, they add a bathroom and they add another bedroom and a pool and whatever. So suddenly now the value is going to go from $1 million to $1.4 million. And it's on the back of a false classification of a standalone bathroom, a toilet now called a bathroom. So and the banks are pretty aware of this. So one of the biggest risks you've got, you want to see the property go through that normal arm's length transaction and market it properly. So you can join the dots. So I think a lot of the fraud monitoring and fraud management, they're pretty sophisticated now. I've got to say, I've got to give it to the banks on that front.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question, or did I just ramble on?
No, you did. I mean, I was talking about whether that actually could be a strategy, and I think finding undervalued properties based on an AVM is only going to get you so far.
Only
and
so
of course,
far.
can get you into trouble. But yeah, when you're looking at things that a filter will kill, but it's an outlier. That's where I was kind of thinking, is there enough in that to actually be a niche strategy for an investor?
Well, you add too many filters, you narrow your focus, and you don't look at the suburbs that you filtered out. You look at the suburbs that you filtered in, and that's the problem. So it's forcing your gaze, forcing your focus down to 20 or 30 or whatever that count of suburbs is. And 70 or 80% of them are all around Townsville and North Queensland. So that's where everyone's looking. This self-fulfilling prophecy is one of the drivers for these price rises. And so, and then it stops. And when it stops, it's like, well, where do all the eyes go? Because that filter will stop. As soon as the price increases stop, as soon as prices get too high and yields start to fall down, then nobody's looking there anymore, right? They're looking somewhere else. They're back down in Geelong.
It's a bit like live by the filter sword, die by the filter sword.
That'll work for me too. Yeah, so I think that there's problems because it's easy for us to find brilliant houses without using those filters and just sticking to the looking at the SA3s. And you're buying the house, you're buying the right house in the right suburb, and you're going to ignore so many properties if you stick to that silly suburb level filter approach. It's wrong.
You said it very succinctly.
Yeah,
sorry, mate, you said it very succinctly.
It's wrong, I was using it. I was part and parcel of that. The only get out I give myself is that I called out some of these risks before. Now I'm probably being a little bit more vocal because it's getting worse, and the software that's being built around these filters is really beautiful. So that just that just lures people in to trust it more, when the reality is the process is really flawed.
Yeah, it becomes more and more pervasive and beguiling when it's in a beautiful user interface and you assume that this is the last truth.
Exactly. There's probably another analogy, the girlfriend or boyfriend or husband analogy in that too. You could probably,
I think we've probably done that to death, and it was pretty ordinary to begin with. But what hasn't been ordinary has been your insights into the dangers of filters and the impact that they're having on the space. It's hard to argue that they're not finding their way more and more into the way that we as property investors due diligence. And when you said it quite succinctly, it stood out to me that you can't buy a suburb. You can't. The property's not an index. You actually have to transact on one particular thing, and it might sit outside the filter, and you've lost that opportunity. So, a really, really good lesson for property investors that are searching nationally for that next property. So, thanks very much for your data experiment and wisdom today.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be back again after all these years.
It's been a while, but we'll get you back on soon. Cheers, mate.
Thank you.